What if I told you that one simple idea could take you from being broke, hopeless and invisible, to becoming a millionaire loved by millions? This isn't fiction. It's real. A 22-year-old boy named Mason Reed walked out of Mississippi with nothing but a dream, a heart full of struggle, and a voice full of stories. He wasn't a businessman, he wasn't rich, and he had no safety net. But he discovered something the world had ignored. Stories about loyalty, about the unbreakable bond between humans and dogs. He told them with honesty, with heart, and with pain carved into his words. And slowly, people began to listen. This is not just a story about a boy and his struggles. It's a story about how one idea, born in the darkest moment, can change everything. The question is, if Mason could do it, what's stopping you? Mason Reed was 22 when he realized he could not go on living the way he had been. Mississippi was home, but home didn't feel like a place of possibility anymore. Every corner of the small town reminded him of limitations. Low-wage jobs, worn-out faces, and the constant struggle to make ends meet. He was slim, sharp-featured, with an attractive spark in his eyes that carried more hope than reality. People around him often said he was too much of a dreamer. And maybe they were right, but Mason felt that if he didn't chase something bigger, he would suffocate in a life of just enough. For months, he tried to think of a way forward. He had no savings, no family money, and no powerful connections. All he had was a restless heart and a head full of scattered ideas. Nights stretched long in his small rented room, where he sat under a dim lamp, scribbling thoughts in a beat-up notebook. He wrote lines like, "There must be something people want, something that brings meaning, something that makes them smile." Mason worked odd jobs here and there, at a small diner, at a hardware store, sometimes hauling boxes in a warehouse. But every dollar he earned felt like sand slipping through his fingers. Rent ate one part, food ate the rest, and nothing remained for the future he wanted so badly. One evening, after another long shift, Mason sat outside on a porch. Across the street, an older man played with his Labrador. The dog wagged its tail, running circles, eyes filled with loyalty and love. The man laughed, clapping his hands as if the dog had just given him back a piece of joy that life had taken away. Something clicked inside Mason. He had always loved animals, especially dogs. He remembered his childhood beagle, Scout, who would wait outside the school gate every day until Mason walked out. Scout wasn't just a pet, he had been family. When Mason was sad, Scout would rest his head on Mason's knee, as if silently saying, "I'm here, no matter what." That night, Mason scribbled frantically in his notebook. "Dogs and humans," he wrote. "Loyalty, hope, stories." Then an idea emerged. What if he told stories about dogs, their loyalty, and the bond they had with humans? Not fairy tales, not childish tales, but powerful, emotional stories that touched hearts. At first, the thought felt absurd. Who would pay to listen to dog stories? But the more Mason thought about it, the more it made sense. People loved dogs. They didn't just own them. They loved them like children, like partners, like soulmates. If he could tell stories that reminded people of that bond, he might give them something priceless: comfort, happiness, and connection. Still, Mason knew ideas meant nothing without action. After weeks of hesitation, he made his choice. He would leave Mississippi. He had heard about Washington, D.C., a city full of wealthy families, politicians, business leaders, and, importantly, dog lovers. It was risky. It was scary. But he told himself, "If I fail, I'll at least fail chasing something that matters to me." With a backpack of clothes, his notebook, and less than $100, Mason boarded a bus to Washington. The city was overwhelming at first. The noise, the towering buildings, the rush of people. It all made Mason feel like an ant crawling across a giant floor. He rented a tiny, almost broken room on the edge of the city. The bed creaked with every move, and the walls were thin enough to hear neighbors fighting at night. He had barely enough money for rent and cheap sandwiches. But Mason had no time to complain. He went straight to dog parks, introducing himself awkwardly to strangers. "Hi, I'm Mason. I tell stories about dogs. Would you like to hear one?" Most people laughed politely and walked away. Some ignored him completely. Rejection stung, but he reminded himself that big ideas never start easy. One rainy afternoon, Mason noticed a man with a husky sitting under a tree. The man looked sad, lost in thought. Mason hesitated but then approached. "Can I share a story?" he asked softly. The man shrugged. "Go ahead, kid." Mason took a deep breath and began. He told a short story about a husky who stayed by his owner's side during years of struggle, refusing to leave even when food was scarce. He spoke with passion, his voice trembling but strong. The man listened. By the end, he wiped a tear from his eye. "That was something," the man said. He pulled out a few dollars and handed them to Mason. "Not much, but you earned it." Mason walked back to his room that night with damp shoes but a burning heart. It worked. His idea wasn't crazy after all. For weeks, Mason kept at it. He told stories in parks, on sidewalks, and sometimes in coffee shops when people allowed him. The money was little. Sometimes only a few dollars, sometimes nothing. But the smiles and tears he saw on faces gave him fuel to keep going. There were nights he lay on his thin mattress, stomach empty, wondering if he could last another week. He thought about giving up, finding another low-paying job. But every time he closed his eyes, he remembered the look in people's faces when his stories reached them. That look kept him alive. One evening, Mason was invited by a woman from the park to her home. She owned a golden retriever and said, "I'd love for my family to hear one of your stories." Mason was nervous but agreed. Inside the warm, well-furnished home, Mason told a story about a golden retriever who saved his owner from loneliness after losing a partner. The family was silent throughout, then clapped warmly when he finished. The woman handed him $50. Mason's hands shook as he accepted it. $50 for one story. He had never made that much in an hour in his entire life. That night, lying on his bed, Mason whispered, "This is only the beginning." Mason Reed was only 22, but the streets of Washington had already aged him faster than he expected. Every day was a grind, finding new people willing to listen, pushing down the sting of rejection, and fighting hunger when his pocket was empty. Yet, with every story he told, his confidence grew. He wasn't just a dreamer anymore. He was becoming a storyteller, and slowly, people began to notice. The night after he earned his first $50, Mason couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling of his small, cracked apartment, replaying the scene in his head. A real family, sitting in their living room, had listened to him as if he were more than just a poor boy with an idea. They had paid him not out of pity, but out of appreciation. That thought kept him warm, even though the heater in his room barely worked. The next morning, Mason bought himself a decent breakfast. Eggs, toast, and coffee. He hadn't tasted something that good in months. As he sipped the coffee, he opened his notebook and wrote, "This is not just storytelling. This is connection. This is healing. If I keep going, this will change my life." At first, Mason's system was simple. He would hang out in dog parks, walk through neighborhoods with lots of pet owners, or even stand near vet clinics. He didn't carry posters or flyers. He only carried his voice, his notebook, and the courage to walk up to strangers. But soon, his stories spread. Washington was a city where word traveled quickly. One dog owner would tell another, "There's this young guy, Mason, who tells stories about dogs that make you cry and laugh at the same time." Another would add, "You should invite him to your house. He's incredible." Within weeks, Mason started receiving small invitations. Families, couples, and even individuals would ask him to come over, sit in their living room, and tell a story about loyalty. He often asked them about their own dogs first. The breed, the personality, the little quirks that made them special. Then, in real time, Mason would craft a story around that, blending imagination with emotion. It was like a superpower. People would laugh, sometimes cry, and always thank him. And they paid. At first, $10 or $20, then $50. And slowly, some clients began offering him hundreds. But the path wasn't smooth. For every family that welcomed him, there were 10 people who mocked him. "You're charging money to tell dog stories. That's ridiculous," some said. Others brushed past him without a word. There were nights when Mason returned home with nothing in his pocket but dust, his stomach growling. On those nights, he thought about giving up, wondered if maybe everyone was right, that his idea was stupid, childish. One particularly cold evening, Mason walked the streets until midnight, knocking on doors, asking dog owners if they wanted to hear a story. Everyone said no. He ended up sitting on a bench, shivering in the dark, his notebook pressed against his chest. For a brief moment, despair whispered in his ear, "This is it. You're done. You'll never make it." But then a Labrador walked past with its owner. The dog suddenly pulled the leash and ran up to Mason, licking his hands as if it knew him. Mason smiled through his tears. "Even dogs believe in me," he whispered. "How can I stop now?" And Mason pushed forward. As weeks turned into months, he started refining his craft. He didn't just tell random stories anymore. He created themes. Some stories were about loyalty in hard times, others about dogs who gave courage to their owners, and some about how dogs taught humans to love unconditionally. Each story carried a moral, a message that touched the human heart. By now, Mason was earning enough to pay rent comfortably and eat decently. He even managed to buy a better jacket for the winter. But he wanted more, not just money, but impact. That's when he had another idea. Instead of only telling stories in homes or parks, what if he performed in small public spaces, cafes, pet shops, or even community events? That way he could reach dozens of people at once, and maybe even charge more. So Mason began approaching businesses. Most turned him away, saying they didn't want a random boy wasting their customers' time. But one cafe owner in Georgetown, who had 3 beagles herself, decided to give him a chance. "You can perform here this Saturday," she said. "No promises, but let's see what happens." Mason was terrified. He had never spoken to a group larger than a family before. On Saturday, about 20 people sat with their coffee, dogs curled under the tables, waiting for this young stranger to speak. Mason stood in front of them, his voice shaking at first. Then, he began telling a story about a soldier who returned home from war, broken inside, but whose dog never left his side until he healed. By the end of the story, the cafe was silent, except for the sound of sniffles and dogs shifting quietly. When Mason finished, the room erupted in applause. People came up afterward, shaking his hand, thanking him. Some gave him money. The cafe owner hugged him and said, "You're welcome here anytime." A Mason walked home that night under the city lights, heart racing. This wasn't just a side hustle anymore. This was becoming a career. The weeks that followed were a blur of growth. Mason's schedule filled with requests. He was invited to pet shops, cafes, and even small community halls. Social media posts about him started circulating, short clips, photos, and testimonials from clients. Suddenly, Mason was not just that boy who tells dog stories. He was Mason Reed, the dog storyteller. But with growth came new challenges. One evening after a performance, a wealthy businessman approached Mason. He praised Mason's talent, but then leaned closer, whispering, "You should make it spicier. People pay more for entertainment than for emotions. Add some drama, some lies. Make the stories less about dogs and more about scandal." A Mason froze. For a second, the offer was tempting, a chance to earn quick money. But deep inside, he knew that wasn't him. His gift wasn't in lies or scandal. It was in truth, in loyalty, in the bond between people and their dogs. So he shook his head and walked away. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "Stay loyal to the loyalty." Mason's turning point came 6 months later. By then, he was charging premium rates for private sessions and public performances. But more importantly, he realized he could expand beyond Washington. Through video calls, he started offering storytelling sessions to people across the country. Some were dog lovers who wanted comfort. Others were lonely souls who just wanted to feel connected. Mason gave them both, stories that healed and voices that soothed. His reach grew. Money started flowing. For the first time, Mason had a savings account that didn't sit at zero. He upgraded his apartment to a modest but cozy place. He even bought himself a new laptop and microphone to improve his online sessions. But Mason didn't stop there. He remembered his dream not just to survive, but to build something lasting. And so, with the money he was saving, Mason began researching. He studied the pet industry, reading articles and watching videos late into the night. One fact stunned him: Americans spent billions of dollars every year on their dogs. Food, toys, grooming, healthcare. If he could connect his storytelling with that industry, he could create a business that not only made him rich, but also made a difference. That was the seed of his next big step. Mason Reed was 22, but in less than a year, he felt like he had lived through a lifetime of lessons. From the quiet desperation of sitting on a cold bench with an empty stomach to standing in front of cafes filled with applauding dog lovers, his life had flipped upside down. Still, Mason knew this was only the beginning. The stories had given him money, but money wasn't his final goal. He wanted freedom, stability, and a way to leave a permanent mark. He wanted to build something bigger than himself, something that would carry the loyalty of dogs into the world in a way no one had imagined. It started with a simple observation. One night, after finishing a storytelling session over video call with a woman in Texas, Mason sat at his desk scrolling through pet industry articles. A headline caught his eye. Pet owners in the U.S. spend over $100 billion annually on their pets. Mason's eyes widened. He read further. Food, grooming, toys, vet care. Dogs weren't just pets. They were family members, and people were willing to spend everything to keep them happy and healthy. That's when it hit him. He had already won the trust of dog owners through his stories. He wasn't just another salesman. He was someone who connected deeply with them, who made them cry, laugh, and appreciate their dogs more. If he offered them something valuable for their dogs, something real, something with the same heart as his stories, they would trust him. The next day, Mason scribbled an idea in his notebook: dog care and feed built on loyalty. For at first, Mason had no clue where to start. He had no degree in business, no background in nutrition, and no investors. But he had time, determination, and the habit of knocking on doors until one finally opened. He began small. He interviewed dozens of dog owners after his storytelling sessions, casually asking what they fed their pets, what problems they faced, and what they wished existed in the market. Many complained about overpriced food with chemicals, or treats that made their dogs sick. Some wished for something more natural, more ethical, more trustworthy. Mason listened, and he began to sketch his vision: dog feed that was organic, clean, and affordable. Something that people could feel proud to give their dogs. But creating food wasn't like telling stories. He needed knowledge. So Mason started spending evenings in libraries, researching pet nutrition. He connected with vet students, nutritionists, and even local dog shelters. Slowly, he pieced together the basics of what a balanced, healthy dog diet should look like. Of course, knowledge wasn't enough. Mason needed money to actually create and test a product. By then, his storytelling income had grown, but he still lived modestly. Every dollar mattered. For months, he worked like a machine, storytelling sessions during the day, research at night, saving almost everything he earned. Finally, Mason scraped together enough to produce his first batch. He found a small local kitchen that allowed him to rent their space late at night. There, with borrowed equipment, he cooked his first version of Loyal Bites, his dog feed brand. The first few bags were rough, hand-packed, with labels printed on his cheap home printer. They looked far from professional. But Mason didn't care. He handed them out for free to his regular storytelling clients who owned dogs. "Try it," he said. "Tell me honestly what you think." The feedback was better than he expected. "My dog loved it," one client told him. "He usually refuses new food, but he finished every bite." Another said, "If you sell this properly, Mason, you'll be onto something huge." Encouraged, Mason kept refining the recipe, using natural ingredients, improving taste, and balancing nutrition. Slowly, Loyal Bites began to gain a small following. But success never comes without struggle. Just when Mason started selling small quantities, competition appeared. Big companies dominated the pet food market. His homemade brand looked like a joke compared to their glossy bags and million-dollar advertising. Some shopkeepers laughed in his face when he tried to pitch Loyal Bites. "Come back when you're real," one sneered. Those words burned Mason, but instead of breaking him, they fueled him. He doubled down on what made him different: authenticity. Mason didn't just sell food, he told a story with every bag. He recorded short videos where he explained the love and loyalty behind his product. often with a dog sitting by his side. He used the same voice that made people cry in his sessions, but now he applied it to his business. And slowly, something amazing happened. People began buying not because of the glossy packaging, but because they trusted Mason. They had heard his stories, seen his sincerity, and felt his passion. In a world flooded with fake ads and empty promises, Mason's honesty stood out. By the end of his second year, Mason was juggling two worlds. On one side, he was still the storyteller, standing in cafes, appearing on video calls, charging premium fees for sessions that brought healing and joy. On the other, he was now a small entrepreneur, selling Loyal Bites in pet shops and online, fulfilling orders by hand. It wasn't easy. Mason barely slept. Some nights, he was so exhausted from packaging feed that he couldn't even prepare properly for his storytelling gigs. His body was tired, but his spirit kept burning. What kept him going was the vision. He wasn't working just for himself anymore. Every time he saw a dog happily munching on Loyal Bites, every time a customer thanked him for creating something natural and affordable, Mason felt a deep sense of purpose. Then came the turning point. A local Washington newspaper picked up his story. From storyteller to entrepreneur, young man builds dog food brand from scratch. The article went viral online. Suddenly, Mason's inbox exploded with messages from dog lovers across the country, from investors curious about his brand, even from journalists wanting to interview him. Loyal Bites was no longer a small, hidden project. It was on the map. Orders flooded in. Mason realized he couldn't do it alone anymore. He began hiring employees. First just 2, then 10, then dozens. Many of them were people like him, young and struggling, looking for a chance. He trained them not just to work but to care. This isn't about selling food, he told them. It's about loyalty. If we forget that, we're nothing. The warehouse grew. The packaging improved. Loyal Bites went from hand-packed bags to professionally designed products stacked on store shelves. Mason was building more than a company. He was building an empire of loyalty. But Mason never forgot where it all started, with the stories. Even as his schedule filled with business meetings and factory visits, he still set aside time every week to tell stories. Sometimes in person, sometimes online, sometimes just recording short clips for his followers. His audience loved it. To them, Mason wasn't just a businessman. He was still the boy who reminded them why they loved their dogs so much. And that combination, heart and business, made him unstoppable. By year 6, Mason Reed had gone from a broke 22-year-old on the streets of Washington to a millionaire entrepreneur. Loyal Bites was sold nationwide, and his storytelling sessions were booked months in advance. He had bought his own house, hired dozens of employees, and even opened a foundation to support dog shelters. But Mason's greatest pride wasn't the money, or even the fame. It was walking into his warehouse one morning, seeing bags of Loyal Bites being shipped across the country, and whispering to himself, "One idea. Just one idea changed my life." That's the end of part 3, Alu 20,500 words. Here Mason transitions from struggling storyteller into a successful entrepreneur with Loyal Bites. Mason Reed was 28 now, though in his heart, he still felt like the hungry, restless 22-year-old who once walked the streets of Washington with nothing but a dream. The difference was that now, people knew his name. Not just dog lovers in Washington, but pet owners across the country. Some even called him the loyalty guy. Loyal Bites, the brand that started in a rented kitchen with hand-packed bags, had grown into a full-scale company. Its products were on the shelves of major pet stores, featured in online ads, and shipped across the United States. Mason had built more than a business. He had built a movement. People weren't just buying food. They were buying into the idea of loyalty, the bond between human and dog that Mason had celebrated since his very first story. But success came with new challenges. With every expansion, Mason faced competitors trying to copy his formula. Large corporations, threatened by the rise of Loyal Bites, launched smear campaigns, questioning the quality of his food. Some even released similar organic brands designed to steal his market share. At first, Mason panicked. He worried that his dream would collapse under the weight of giants with deeper pockets and louder voices. But then he reminded himself of the truth: his strength was never just the product, it was the story. So Mason fought back, not with flashy commercials, but with honesty. He recorded videos of himself visiting dog shelters, donating food, and talking directly to customers about why he started Loyal Bites. His sincerity shined through, and people rallied behind him. The more corporations attacked, the more loyal Mason's followers became. One night, scrolling through comments online, Mason found one that brought him to tears. "Mason, you don't just sell food. You remind me why I love my dog. That's why I'll always buy from you." It was then he realized, this wasn't just about building a company. It was about building trust. With his business stable, Mason turned toward something bigger: giving back. He remembered the nights when he couldn't afford food, when he almost gave up. He knew countless others were still in that place, young, struggling, and desperate for a way out. So Mason launched the Loyal Heart Foundation, a program that partnered with dog shelters and community centers. It provided free food for rescue dogs, funded training programs, and even sponsored youth entrepreneurship workshops. When reporters asked him why he did it, Mason always gave the same answer: because loyalty isn't just about dogs. It's about people too. Someone believed in me once, and now it's my turn to believe in others. And despite his success, Mason never lost his simplicity. He still dressed casually: jeans, sneakers, and a shirt. He still carried the same old notebook where he once scribbled his first idea. And he still found joy in small things: a dog wagging its tail, a smile from a stranger, a walk at sunset. But Mason's life had undeniably changed. He owned a modern house in Washington, with wide glass windows that overlooked the city. He once wandered as a broke dreamer. He had cars, investments, and shops under his name. He had employees who depended on him and customers who trusted him. Mason Reed was now a millionaire, but he never called himself rich. He liked to say, "I'm not rich because of the money. I'm rich because I found a way to turn one idea into a life of meaning." The turning point of Mason's empire came when Loyal Bites expanded into more than food. After years of saving and reinvesting, Mason launched Loyal Care, a network of dog care centers across major cities. These weren't just kennels. They were luxury care spaces designed with love. Dogs could play, rest, and receive the best treatment while their owners were at work. Mason's team trained staff not only in care but in compassion, embedding the same spirit that made his brand different from day one. The centers became a hit. Busy professionals trusted them, knowing their pets weren't just being looked after, but being loved. Soon, Mason had centers in Washington, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. By the time he turned 30, Mason's empire spanned food, care, and even dog accessories. He had thousands of employees and a brand valued at millions. Yet whenever he looked in the mirror, he still saw the 22-year-old kid who once whispered to himself, "One idea can change my life." But Mason also knew fame could fade, money could be lost, and empires could fall. What he wanted most was to leave a legacy that no market crash or competitor could erase. So he returned to where it all began: storytelling. On weekends, Mason began hosting live events called Loyalty Nights. These were evenings where he told stories about the bond between dogs and humans. Stories of rescue, sacrifice, love, and loss. People brought their dogs, sat in open-air theaters, and listened with tears in their eyes. At the end of each event, Mason would always say the same words: "This isn't just my story. This is our story." One idea, one act of loyalty, can change everything. The events became legendary, drawing crowds from across the country. Some said Mason's words healed them more than therapy. Others claimed it brought families closer to their dogs. Mason didn't care about the reviews. For him, every wagging tail and every grateful smile was proof that his mission was alive. Of course, life wasn't without its struggles. Mason still faced critics. Some accused him of being too emotional in business. Others claimed his success was luck. But Mason had stopped caring about proving himself to doubters. He had already proven everything he needed, to himself and to the millions who believed in him. When asked in an interview what he would tell young dreamers, Mason answered simply, "Don't wait for the perfect moment. Don't wait for permission. The world will tell you you're not ready, that you don't have enough money, enough education, enough connections. I had none of those. What I had was one idea, and the courage to act on it. That's all you need. By now, Mason's story had reached beyond the US. International markets were opening, and people overseas wanted loyal bites too. Mason was careful though. He didn't want to grow so fast that he lost his values. Every new step was measured, every expansion built on the foundation of trust. And as his empire grew, Mason never forgot to invest in himself. He read books, learned from mentors, and surrounded himself with people who shared his vision. Unlike many who lost themselves in fame, Mason stayed grounded. At 32, Mason was invited to give a TED Talk. Standing on the Red Circle stage, facing thousands of people, he began the same way he had started all those years ago, with a story. He spoke about loyalty, about his journey, about how dogs taught him more about business than any classroom ever could. The talk went viral, watched by millions online. Once again, Mason wasn't just an entrepreneur, he was an inspiration. Years later, Mason often sat in his backyard, his own loyal dog curled at his feet, watching the sun set over Washington. He thought about the boy he once was, broke, lost, and hungry. He thought about the risks, the sleepless nights, the failures and victories, and he whispered again, with a smile, "One idea made me rich, but loyalty made me whole."